Special afternoon. Everybody's keeping his or her fingers crossed for the outcome of the US election, and we have a conversation on the election today with a very special perspective. We don't want only to talk about the transatlantic relationship. Of course, this will be an issue too, but especially we would like to shed light on the global south, on the multilateralism issues, and on the UN institutions and what the election means for them. So we have very, very interesting guests today. We have the political analyst and we have the political activist. In fact, both had been colleagues sometimes before, and both are in Washington, and both are very close to politics and acting in the political realms since decades, both of them. So it's with very, very great pleasure to welcome you, and Dr. Deissner will do the introduction, but I would like to introduce Dr. Deissner, who is the CEO of the Atlantic Bridge, a very, very important association here in Germany, and David Deissner will do the moderation. And I'm very thankful and happy to welcome you. And please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ingrid Tam, for the kind introduction. Yeah, also a warm welcome from my side. Yeah, well, these are very special days. This is here in Europe a very historic afternoon and a historic day in the US as we are approaching the final counts of the remaining votes in the United States. Of course, it is a very tight race. We are looking particularly at the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. Of course, it has also caused quite some concern, probably on both sides of the Atlantic, that the president himself had called into question the legitimacy of the process, the validity of the votes, called it fraudulent. This has caused concern as well, not only here in Europe, but also, in the Democratic Party, but also in parts on the Republican side in the United States. So, is this still a resilient democracy? How much harm do we see here in the democratic system? Certainly some of the questions that we will address. But as Ingrid Ham has just outlined, we will not only talk about what we see in these days, and the election itself, although of course that will be addressed, but also we would like to shift the perspective a little bit and discuss the implications of the election on multilateralism at the global south, with a special focus on the African continent. And I'm very happy to announce our two speakers here today. We have with us today Gail Smith. She is the CEO of the One campaign. Gail served as a top advisor on development issues for 2 American presidents and is certainly one of the world's leading experts in global development. She brings an unparalleled expertise on development and democracy issues and an extraordinary network of relationships across the African continent and around the world, really. In her most recent role, administrator of USAID, Gail led a staff of more than 10,000 people working to end extreme poverty, foster sustained and inclusive economic growth, and promote resilient democratic societies all over the world. Gail, it's great to have you today here on the call.
Great to be here.
Historic day. A very warm welcome also to Michael Wertz. He is Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. and a MacArthur Senior Fellow since 2020. He studied philosophy, Latin American studies, and political science. He was also teaching and a researcher in Germany and also in the United States. Michael focuses on US politics and social transformation processes and advises German research institutions and foundations on the formation of international networks, especially in the US. He's one of the most prominent experts on US foreign policy in German media, certainly, also in the US, but widely received in German media as well, particularly these days. And I'm very honored to welcome you, Michael, as well. You also serve on the board of our institution, Atlantic Brücke. Great to have you.
Glad to be part of the discussion. Thank you.
Gail, let me ask the first question to you. What do you make of the current situation? It's a very tight race, as I said in my introduction. How do you assess the current situation? Where's the race going? Is it, are we, is it already decided or not? I mean, there's quite some debate, and we would like to hear your perspective.
Well, I think a lot of people would like to just go ahead and declare that Biden has won. In fact, overnight, he pulled ahead in Georgia, and he has just now pulled ahead in Pennsylvania. But I think the fundamental premise, and it's one he's advocated and has been at the heart of a lot of the tension around this election, there are still votes to be counted. So I think that until all of those votes are counted, I don't think there will be an official declaration by anyone. Now, as has been referenced, as I'm sure many people followed, President Trump has declared that the election is corrupt and has been rigged and was illegitimate. Interestingly, there's been a lot of pushback on that, including from prominent Republicans and the media. But I do think we're going to enter into a period of extensive litigation. The Trump team has already signaled and has already launched a number of lawsuits. Some of that is normal. We will have a lot more of it than is usually the case. And the judges will decide whether they take those cases on or not. And if they do, they will look into whatever's been alleged and will proceed. So we may have an interesting sort of two-part process here. On the one hand, there may be a determination in the media that the numbers are such that Joe Biden has won the election and there's no way to dispute that. There's a period of 20 days before elections are certified, and then the Electoral College actually meets. That will go on. We'll have a period of litigation. It's pretty clear. So I think a more formal announcement may wait, but we will have to see. I think the coming hours are going to be absolutely key in this in terms of where the numbers go, most importantly in Pennsylvania.
Michael, if I may throw it over to you, you work for the Center for American Progress, which is, of course, an institution which is very close to the Democratic Party, just for transparency purposes. So everyone probably knows what the result that you are hoping for, and I think fair to say probably majority of Germans. Where do you see the race going? Has it already been decided? And also, what do you make of those claims that parts of the ballots or the votes might be illegitimate? We also saw our former ambassador here in Berlin, Rick Grinnell, saying that in Nevada, lots of those votes were illegitimate, illegal. Is that still a risk for the outcome? Where do you see?
Yeah. I don't think so. I'm with Gail here. I think this is done. It's fairly clear that Vice President Biden has won Nevada fairly clearly. In Arizona, it's a little tighter, but he will win Arizona. He pulled ahead in Georgia. I had a chance to talk to Democratic Party representatives in Atlanta, and they think that Biden will win Georgia by 5,000 to 7,000 votes. This will trigger an automatic recount, which is required by law. If he wins Georgia and Pennsylvania, where local Democratic politicians estimate that he will end up with a healthy lead of about 100,000 votes, then we have a clearer picture than we thought in the Electoral College. It would be 306 versus 231 in favor of Joe Biden. More importantly, Biden is on track to gain the popular vote, so the nationwide votes that have been submitted by close to 5%, which is substantial. And so this is all in all a picture where hopefully in hindsight, we'll be able to say this is a decision that has been taken by the American people that is fairly clear. But we don't know yet, as Gail said. I mean, there's a lot of litigation. 2 of the lawsuits that the Trump campaign has submitted have already been tossed out for, you'll be surprised to hear this, lack of evidence. Some of the lawsuits strike me, I'm not a legal expert, strike me as frivolous, but we will see how the courts decide. What I think what is of importance for our friends in the in Europe and for you guys over in Germany particularly is that Donald Trump has been elected by over 70 million Americans. He has more votes than Obama got in 2008. And so there is such a strong part of the American middle class, the conservative segments of the American middle class, that still supports this president after the experience of the last 4 years and close to 250,000 people having died during the pandemic. I think that's something that has to be factored in when it comes to multilateral affairs, when it comes to transatlantic relations, and also policies that the Europeans are thinking about.
Thank you so much. Before we carry on with the discussion, I just would like to make one small housekeeping remark, which I forgot about in my introduction. Of course, we invite all our participants to ask their questions in the Q&A box, and after roughly 20 minutes, I will include them in the discussion and try to include as many questions as possible. And please also state your name if you ask a question. I was wondering, and maybe the next question, first to you, Gail, again, and then to you, Michael. You know, given the fact that the US has, you know, for decades been regarded as the guarantor of the liberal order of democracy, is this kind of role model now damaged? Can the US go back to that kind of, you know, global, you know, that role as a global player and guarantor of democratic orders all around the world? Or is that now kind of, you know, damaged for good, as it were? Okay, what do you think?
Well, I think it's different because I think, you know, this election itself, I think, is a real test of democracy, and the signs suggest that that's the direction we're going to go in, as opposed to one that just declares an election illegitimate and says I won, whether or not a person actually won. I do think we've learned an enormous amount, and that is that, you know, you don't ever reach the point of being a democracy and then you say fine and you just rest on your laurels. You've got to constantly feed it, strengthen it, and nurture it. And we've seen, I think, exposed in the last several years, several places where we got weaknesses in the system. And I think that that's been exacerbated by something that I know has been an issue in Germany and elsewhere. When I grew up, we all watched the evening news, and maybe you watched different broadcasts, but we all had the same baseline of information. And today we don't have that because people seek or are fed their news from whatever perspective they adopt. So we've also got to work at figuring out what is the common baseline, because that's been eroded. Mm-hmm. I do think what could be interesting, assuming Vice President Biden wins and is declared the winner and moves into office as the president. Back in the time when I was in the Obama administration, we did something called the Open Government Partnership, which was an alliance between governments and civil society, mostly around transparency. But the interesting thing was we were a member. It wasn't the United States saying, as a democracy, you should all do X, Y, and Z, and we'll provide some assistance for you to do that. It was more, all of us need to be more transparent as governments. So I think there is a potential opening for the US to still play a prominent role on issues of democracy and governance, but in a more participatory way, which quite frankly, I think gives us a bit of credibility. There's some humility embedded in that. The second thing I do think that a President Biden would be strong on would be convening and engaging with other democracies around the world at a time when he's expressed great concern about the rise of authoritarianism in regions around the world. So I think that's another way that he would proceed. I also think he would proceed with confidence, but with humility, based on what's happened.
Thank you. Michael, what do you think? You know, of course, one could argue that the American democracy is kind of dysfunctional in so many aspects at the moment. Of course, you know, the election process itself seems to be going fairly smoothly so far. Nonetheless, we have a highly polarized society, as you just outlined. We have, you know, that kind of gap between the Trump voters and the mainstream media, which are considered, you know, from their perspective to be biased. You know, so the kind of res publica, that space where people, you know, exchange views based on good arguments, that doesn't seem to work anymore. So, you know, what's the harm that has been done to democracy within the last couple of years, and how can that be restored from your perspective?
Right. I mean, let's breathe and take some time, get this litigation out of the way, and then think and start strategizing about it. I think, as you mentioned, the election, especially under the conditions of a pandemic and a tough confrontation between the political camps in the United States, has gone astonishingly smoothly. There seem to have been limited external interventions in cyber attacks, and the process itself, I think, with a degree of transparency, with webcams and voting counting centers, with a lot of the administrators giving interviews in the past few days, has been a model of transparency. And I think it was a free and fair election. And somebody sent around a post by the Zimbabwean National News Agency a couple of hours ago with a photo of Donald Trump, and it said the United States risks sanctions from Zimbabwe if elections are not free and fair. And I think we have luckily made sure that Zimbabwe is not going to sanction us. But on a more serious matter, the question of how the United States reconstitutes its image and its reputation and its leverage in the world is going to be an interesting question. As Gail has said, it seems that a lot of people that are advising Biden, especially the younger folks, know that a certain degree of humility is required. And they also know that the big challenge is going to be that the president's time is such a finite resource, and much of that will be geared towards the massive decade-long domestic reform projects that we will be facing, from climate to finance to education to health and so on and so forth. My concern is that I think some of the people that are thinking about US foreign policy have not fully grasped the degree to which the reputation of the United States has been deteriorated over the last 4 years. And that will have practical consequences, because those same people often overly rely on American military might and economic influence and do not recognize enough, in my eyes, that one of the biggest levers that the United States have is actually immaterial. It's the capacity of bringing countries together, creating coalitions that Gail spoke about, engaging private sector and NGOs, and also kind of being in a situation where other countries want to be seen with us shoulder by shoulder. And I would completely understand if policymakers in Germany and Japan and Taiwan and South Korea and Latin America say, okay, we love you, Joe Biden, but can you guarantee that in 2024, you Americans won't elect Mike Pompeo for president? And the answer is we can guarantee that. So I would understand that some of our traditional partners might be a little reluctant in spending too much domestic political capital, because we have lost the confidence of the world, and that you can only rebuild step by step, and it will take time that we actually don't have.
At this moment, it might be a good point in time to throw in a little survey that we have prepared. So I would like to invite all our viewers today to take part in that. So the first question would be, and we partially addressed it already in our discussion, how did Donald Trump change the way the world is looking at the United States today? So you may click one answer or a couple of them, and we will look at the result in a couple of minutes. As I said in my introduction, Gail, I would like to, focus a little bit more, more specifically on the global South. Michael, you just mentioned it briefly already. Commentators in many African countries actually have sharply criticized the government of President Trump, stating that the US could not teach Africa about democracy and human rights anymore. Ongoing talks about election manipulation, fake news, fear of civil war. What does this say in your, from your perspective about the US global image as a world police and advocate of liberties it had for such a long time?
Well, I think there are two things. I think it's going to be important, as I said, to move back into the world with a degree of humility. And I do think in things like convening democracies, we should all be having some straight up conversations about, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the systems and institutions that all of us enjoy and count on in our democracies, and what can we learn from this? Because certainly there's a lot to be learned from the United States, but I think there's a lot to be learned everywhere. So I think humility, a willingness to learn that a democracy is a project in constant motion. It is never finished. But I also think that the United States is likely to be judged as much by its actions. And you know, if an opening foray into Africa is all about talking about democracy and governance and free elections in Africa, that probably won't go down as well as will a re-engagement with the continent on the pandemic, on the economic impact of the pandemic on that entire continent, of the need for access to vaccines, of where the continent's going with the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think if those issues are on the table, that will be the basis for building a relationship where some of these other discussions, I hope, and this is my hope, where some of those conversations can be had with frankness. Because again, I was on the development side of government. I had a diplomatic passport. I wasn't a diplomat, probably because I follow some undiplomatic methods in my communications. But I do think that if part of the aim is to reinforce democracy elsewhere, I would speculate that any of us are going to have as much impact if we are talking with humility about the ongoing project in our own countries as we're talking to other countries about theirs, than when we presume that because we are an older democracy, we've got it all figured out, and now the challenge is for you just to match and mirror what we've done. I think the latter has always been problematic. So, you know, again, I'm always the optimist, but I think this could create a pathway for some much more frank discussion. But again, I think people are going to be looking to what the United States does, not just abroad, but also at home, to figure out what re-engagement looks like.
Michael, what's your viewpoint? I mean, you also look very closely, of course, on the development of the institutions in political Washington, the State Department and other institutions which kind of, you know, back multilateralism or multilateral activities all around the world. Now, particularly when it comes to global aid, you know, we saw those institutions being undermined in terms of staff and funds. So to what extent have they suffered? Could you maybe give us some idea about, you know, the kind of institutional problems in DC and, you know, how can that be repaired and what would have to be done from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we need a reconstruction of government, because what Steve Bannon somewhat awkwardly called the need for the deconstruction of the administrative state in the early months of the Trump administration is something that the government has consistently pursued. If you look at the numbers of open jobs at major departments, State Department may be one of the more important ones, partially because senior officials have just left because they didn't want to be identified with this government. Some of them have been purged. The conversion of the Environmental Protection Agency into the Environmental Destruction Agency, the fact that in USAID there were massive attempts to roll back all programs, all development-related programs that had anything to do with contraception or even information about contraception. I mean, there has a lot of damage being done. The good thing is, contrary than Europe, especially in Germany, where you don't have a change of government, but mostly just a change of secretaries and ministers, you have, in a normal transition from one party to the other, over 4,000 people that gravitate into our massive government here in the United States. This time it's probably going to be a few more because there's so many open jobs. And so I would hope that we have an influx of younger people, new voices, unorthodox thinkers that follow the lead that Gail, and the example that Gail set when she was administrator of USAID. And then I think, I mentioned this before, the president will be massively focused on these domestic challenges. So I hope we'll be able to push for a strategic linkage between domestic and foreign policy and say, look, if you are interested in climate policies and clean energy policies in the United States, and the president has made that one of his priorities, why not link this to re-engagement with COP, to global carbon tax discussions, and to agriculture and in Africa and reforestation in other parts of the world. You can do the same, obviously, with the pandemic, the health issue, and the deepening of the Obamacare reforms or the health reforms are going to be another priority for the next government. But the pandemic has shown that there is no clear distinction between domestic and foreign policy anymore that we got so used to during the Cold War. This has completely changed, and the pandemic is showing that you can create an interesting nexus, which is productive for you at home, and you can also tell this to the American people and make a very strong argument that addressing the health issue here in our country also requires establishing better global multilateral structures, re-engage in the WHO, fix the organization, finance it adequately, and move forward. So it's a big political lift, but I'm semi-optimistic that we'll be having a good discussion around these issues in 2021 and 2022.
David, can I add something to that?
Oh, yes, please.
I think that's right. I think part of the challenge is going to be with the Congress. Now, I think we will likely see, if we're looking at a Biden presidency, a fairly immediate engagement and re-arrival on the world stage with respect to global health and the pandemic. The Vice President's made clear that's an absolute priority. I think on some of the agencies, I think you're absolutely right about the observation that there's been real damage and real change. Our career civil service and foreign service are quite resilient, and I've got a pretty high level of confidence that it will be hard, but a lot of that will bounce back. And I think those are knowable things that need to be done to get the agencies back to a more transparent, quite frankly, function. But here's the really interesting thing. Climate, which a President Biden will give high priority to, as he has said, will likely be a political fight with the Hill. Development, interestingly, all through this administration, as through the Bush and Obama administrations, is one of the few areas where, despite everything else that's gone on, there's actual bipartisan support. So that on repeated occasions when the White House attempted to cut our development budget by 25%, we worked with a coalition of Democrats and Republicans in the Congress to reinstate those cuts successfully. Similarly, on HIV and AIDS, on Gavi and vaccines, and if you had told me 15 or 20 years ago that one of the areas there would be bipartisan support would be on the development budget, I would have told you were hallucinating. But it turns out that that is one area where I think things may be possible, despite what is likely to be a tension between the executive and legislative branches. So I think on development and health, there's openings to move fairly quickly. Climate, I think, will be a fight, but one thing I would say that I think people can watch out for, even though it's become a very political issue, sort of rooted in the anti-multilateralism of some and non-science, people in various states, almost regardless of the political party of their governors or local leaders, are increasingly saying this is an issue, and so we need to address it. So it's going to be a question of getting over the sort of ideological hump and getting to what I think a majority of Americans want to see real action on.
Can I briefly add one or two footnotes to this, David, because I think Gail is absolutely right. We had consistently fairly strong majorities in the American population about the relevance of climate change. And I think experiences in the last few months have only deepened that conviction. I mean, the estimate is that climate-related damage last year in the United States is amounting to $306 billion. And the Environmental Defense Fund did a projection until 2025, and the numbers are going to stay in that region. So there will be economic incentive to think about climate change and about clean energies in a more structured manner. And I think that is an important political argument that you can also make with conservative skeptics. With regard to multilateral organization, I feel that one of the rather interesting developments will be that we will have renewed tensions or problems at the US-Mexico border, because it's you can expect that with Joe Biden elected that the migratory pressure from Central America might increase, because people have a high expectation of being welcomed in the United States and not put into camps on the other side of the border on Mexican territory. And for the United States and the new administration, obviously, that is a very tricky question for domestic political reasons. But I could imagine that the Biden administration is going to work with UNHCR, with the International Organization of Migration at the border. And if you can actually prove, and those organizations have to do their job and be successful. But if you can credibly argue, look, we have taken a lot of tension and pressure off the Mexican and US-Mexican border with the help of these multilateral organizations, you might be in a very different position when it comes to the domestic policy debates.
Thank you, Michael. So let's now look at the outcome of a little survey, which we just started. So the question was, how did Donald Trump change the way the world is looking at the United States? And we see a large majority, 88% of our participants here today, saying the US role model function as an advocate for democracy is fading. Of course, we haven't really specified for how long and how that can be cured, but this is what most people think. And then another 24% who say the Trump administration has finally set an end to the era of US hegemony. And another 60% saying Trump's America First course had made him attractive for authoritarian regimes. Would you like to comment on that? What do you think this is too much of a bleak picture here from our German participants, or would you have different views on this?
No, I mean, look, I think it's been clear to many of us that the entire world has been watching with interest, I think a majority with concern and a minority with some glee at what's transpired in the US over the last few years. And certainly, I mean, I know just in terms of watching the elections, I'm hearing from friends all over the world who are going on as little sleep as I am, because I think we all know that what the US does has a significant impact on the world, regardless of your perspective on the US. So I'm not surprised that people have pretty stark views at this point. I think, again, the question is, how does that change over time? And does it change by sort of reverting to the way things always were, or does it change by moving into the future and modeling and shaping different arrangements and approaches? I don't mean across the board, but in many cases. And I do think that if, in fact, we go through this process and Joe Biden is the president, you know, he's got a lot of experience, as people have pointed out. He headed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's very adept at international relations. He gets international issues in a very deep way. I mean, I know from working with him on development issues, it's not just that he supports it, he gets it in a very important way. So I think, to an earlier point that was made, I think there will still be some trepidation, even if a new administration sort of reemerges on the world stage in a very positive way, believes in multilateralism, believes in cooperation as a force for good. There will probably for some time be a fear that, you know, this may not be sustainable. And I think the other thing everybody's got to remember, I think particularly for Americans, is in the 4 years where we've sort of retreated on the world stage from many of the places we normally would have been active, the world has not stood still. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. The world has moved on, and there are some things remain the same, but some things are very different. So how that's navigated, I think, is going to be key also.
Gail, if I may just ask another question to you. You know, what kind of connection do you see of racial inequality, the protests against police violence in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement, and development policy and political relations with African countries? We saw as a consequence of the murder of George Floyd that all 54 African states signed a demand to the UN Human Rights Council to condemn this kind of racist human rights violations. Do you think that African multilateralism is reaching a kind of new era in the face of these incidents?
Well, I don't know that it's just in face of these incidents, but I do think that the Black Lives Matter movement has put squarely on the agenda an issue which we are very far from resolving in any meaningful way, right? It's another issue that is always a work in progress, but we've got a lot of progress to make. I think that's a very good thing. It's opened up some very frank, straight up, honest dialogue in the United States about some of the systemic reasons, structural reasons, long-term policy and historical reasons that we do not have the equality that we espouse. I think that's good and it's healthy because it forces us to deal with it. I think, again, that also necessitates some humility. And, you know, I think a lot of us felt when the AU issued that statement and when there were various other statements from Africa, that was a positive thing. It's a very good thing that Africa is speaking up about other parts of the world. God knows the rest of the world's been speaking up about Africa for long enough. So I think that's a good thing. But I think there's something else that's going on in Africa that's very significant, of which this is an example, which is for the last 5 to 10 years, the continent has increasingly been acting as a bloc. So went into SDG negotiations with a common position endorsed by heads of state, common position on climate, we'll have a common position on climate, common position on peacekeeping. So I think it is also a force as a continent with much greater political weight than during the times when it was, you know, possible to try to get a few countries to agree with you here and there. And so I think there's been a big strategic shift in Africa's political role in the world. And I think the collective statement was a manifestation of that.
Thank you so much.
And they were right to make the statement.
So you both made quite clear that you think that with a President Biden, not only transatlantic relations would become better, but also US-African relations. Let's again throw in another brief survey, which we've prepared for our viewers. And the next question would be, what do you think would change if Joe Biden becomes the new US president? Again, multiple choice, so you may answer one or a couple of these questions, and we will look at the results in a minute. And then let me now involve our viewers and their questions. We have already, you know, touched a little bit upon on these questions, but again, here we have a question from Sarah Bernardi, and she asks, what would be the priorities for a Biden administration with regard to Africa? Can we expect a return to WHO? Can we expect support for multilateral cooperation with regard to vaccine against COVID-19? Gail, as I said, you already touched a little bit, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. Michael, please join in.
I think we can expect a return to multilateralism, including the WHO, but also, interestingly, the UN Security Council, which has been far less active than it's historically been on a number of issues. I think the Vice President has made very clear, I mean, one of the big differences between the two candidates in this presidential election has obviously been on the pandemic. And I think a President Biden would be very forward-leaning on the pandemic, not just domestically, but also internationally. I think on the African side, you know, look, we've had a period of pretty limited engagement with Africa, to be frank, over the last 4 years. So I think there would be an increase in the engagement. And I think that would be across multiple fronts: development, on the economic side, on the security side. So I think one could easily anticipate a much more robust, active, diplomatically US government engaged with all parts of the world much more extensively than it has been, and supporting the multilateral institutions of which we're a member. So I think those changes are very, very likely.
Mm. Next question, maybe if I may include a question from our viewers to you, Michael, talking about kind of dynamics within the administration. We hope, Sergio Seaborn asks, we hope for an international policy from the Biden administration that is more open to cooperation on the areas of climate change and poverty reduction in Africa. But how much resistance to this should we expect from the US Senate and possibly also from Trump-appointed civil servants within the administration? We talked a lot about, you know, the Senate race. It's also a very tight race, and that will, of course, determine to what extent this new administration, you know, can actually act and freely and push these initiatives.
I think that's a great question. With regard to Trump-appointed civil servants, that's not going to be a massive problem because these politically appointed servants usually submit their letter of resignation when a new president is elected. If not, they can be replaced even against their will. And I would assume that the Biden administration will be very reluctant to maintain a larger number of political appointees in the administration. That is not going to happen. On Capitol Hill, it's obviously more complicated. It's very likely that the Republicans will hold the Senate, but the House of Representatives has the fiscal authority. They allocate the funding, even though the Senate has a say in this. In the House of Representatives, the Democrats have already secured a majority. So 2 of the 3 branches of government will very likely be Democratic, and that gives leverage and possibilities to the president, because he can, and so can the vice president, set political priorities that will then also create a dynamic which will engage private sector actors, non-government organizations, and also, I think, maybe even more importantly, facilitate a discussion where we take a step back and say, look, we have to distinguish between the phenomenon of governance, of global governance and globalization. Globalization is happening, climate, pandemic, energy security, capital flows, migration, I mean, you name it. But the governance structures have been severely fragmented. And the question is, how do you move forward in a situation where governments that are represented in multilateral organizations have their national interests at heart? And how do we get to a conversation where we maybe think about effectiveness and accountability of those multilateral organizations being more important in the ultimate form that the organization takes? So I think the president or the new administrator of USAID or the Secretary of State have a lot of leverage and possibilities to move forward conversations where other countries, other big actors in the global arena need to take a position, and that will provide a basis for a conversation and then ultimately policy outcomes and also allocation of financial resources that we need. You need to want to do this, and you need to invest a lot of time and energy. Hopefully the administration will have the capacity to do that.
Would you like to add on that, Gail, the role of the Senate? Do you agree?
Well, interestingly, as I said on the issue of fighting poverty, there's actually been agreement between both parties on that. I think on climate, there could be more noise, but I also think some of that depends on how that's presented. You know, the climate plan of the Biden administration is focused very much on job creation in the United States. And with the flesh on the bones of that proposal, I think, including for some Republican members of Congress, there's going to be a difficulty in opposing that at a time when we've got a jobs crisis induced by the pandemic. Some of this is also going to depend on how a President Biden would govern. And, you know, there's a lot of debate here. We had a robust Democratic primary with a pretty broad political spectrum represented, and ended up with arguably the most moderate of the Democratic candidates. Joe Biden has a long experience of working across the aisle. The man that John McCain wanted to speak at his funeral was Joe Biden, and John McCain was a Republican and Joe Biden was a Democrat. Now, he comes from that history. Whether he can recreate it and really work across the aisle in the way he did when he was in the Senate, and whether he can persuade people of what he has said he will do, which is, I ran as a Democrat, I will serve as the president of the entire country, he may be able to engage the Senate on some of these issues. Again, it will be an uphill challenge because, as you've all rightly noted, we're very politically divided. But I think it's certainly something he will pursue.
We have a couple of minutes left. Before we come to an end, I'd like to touch upon, probably the most important topic really on the global political agenda, and this is fighting COVID. The COVID-19 containment management in the US was globally seen as, dysfunctional, or certainly not, not a role model. And especially on the African continent, many things were done much better despite less resources at hand. How do you think is this kind of, fading of being a responsible global leader in the pandemic influencing the US standing in the world? And did it maybe also foster a global shift of powers, also towards a more north-south cooperation on eye level and mutual learning, especially in terms of crisis management?
Well, I think look, I hope that one of the things that comes out of this pandemic is some collective mutual learning all around the world, because, this is a global transnational threat. I think that a first priority for a Biden administration, I think, would be getting the pandemic under control in the United States. We are recording higher than ever infection rates, our hospital rates are going up, and our death rates are in the average of 1,000 people a day. So we're in a world of hurt right now domestically. I think on the international side, and particularly with respect to Africa, I think what Africa will likely argue is that the economic impact of this pandemic is in fact far more dangerous than the virus itself. If you look at the incidence of the virus, it's nothing to cast away, but it's not been as high as in some other areas. The economic impact is extraordinary in their countries, looking at the serious risk of default and insolvency. So I think there will most likely be a discussion about what role is the United States going to play, along with Europe, along with the international financial institutions, in ensuring that Africa is able to handle some of the worst economic impacts of this pandemic in the ways that Europe and the United States have, by taking extraordinary measures. So I think the pandemic discussion will likely be focused on its economic dimensions, and then I think also on vaccines, because one of the things that's absolutely critical, both from a right and wrong global justice point of view, but also from an epidemiological point of view, is that vaccines are available to everyone everywhere. And I think that's going to be high on the minds of people, to get that right to the greatest extent possible, as quickly as possible. I don't think we're going to be in a position to advise people about how to manage the pandemic at home for some time.
Michael, do you want to add on that? Or?
Yeah, no, I think Gail's absolutely right. You have to see that we have a lot of work to do here. I talked to a friend in Miami earlier today, who is a Latino activist for the Democratic Party. I asked him what happened there, because Miami, Florida got lost much more significantly than we expected. Also thanks to the opinion polls that once again were off the mark. And I think polling as such should be classified as illegal gambling in the United States after the 2016 and 2020 experience. But he said something interesting, because he said there are some indications that there was a small group of African-American and Latino men that voted for Donald Trump. And I said, how does that happen? And he said, you know what? We had our guy come in here and he had this big black mask on and everybody was social distance. And then Donald Trump came and said, screw the pandemic, here we are, we're gonna be having our rallies. And it seems that that macho attitude of like, it's better to be wealthy and sick than poor and healthy, that resonated. And you also have very concerning numbers that almost half of Republican registered voters would maybe not be easily convinced to vaccinate themselves should we have vaccines available. And so this is really part of the counter-enlightenment that has completely encompassed the Republican Party in the United States. And as Gail said, we have to do a lot of homework before we can pretend to be a model on a global stage. At the same time, American society is rejuvenating. It is a very dynamic society. It has great capacities of political and social self-healing. And I'm fairly optimistic that we hopefully, with President Biden being a more moderate, a more stable personality, a more stable genius in 2021, that we will eventually end up in a situation where we are able to marginalize the most outrageous voices on the extreme right and start a good conversation with our friends on the other side of the political aisle that are also interested in living a good and healthy life for themselves and their children in this country.
Mm-hmm. Well, since this is basically a German American video conference, of course, we, looked at the African continent for very good reasons for quite some time. But also in our opening conversation, we briefly talked about, the effects of, or the implications of, presidency Biden on the transatlantic partnership. I would like to hear your views for, before we close this call on that. Gail, if you were asked to brief the new president, and say it would be President Biden, for his first phone call with Angela Merkel, what would you write in that briefing note? What do you think should be?
I would say we're back. And I think it would then be a question of getting right to work on the big, huge global challenges we face, which has always been at the core of the relationship between the United States and Germany. I would suspect that seeking her views on Europe and the impact of Brexit and everything else, handling the pandemic, the future of Germany, given evolutions and changes there. But I think it would be a conversation that would very quickly move to collaboration. That's certainly what I would advise.
And Mike, a question to you. If you were asked to brief Angela Merkel for her first phone call with the new president, we had a lot of conversations here in Berlin. Would it only be a change of tonality? Would it really be a change in content in terms of all these friction points that we face at the moment in the transatlantic partnership? What should Angela Merkel address first in her phone call with the new president?
Look, I would tell her three things. I would say, first, are prepared for an onslaught of cooperation offers, of re-engagement, and also of the need to clarify policy positions, global policy positions vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis the Mediterranean, the refugee crisis, not only of Germany, but also the European Union. So think about what that means. And then secondly, I would say, tell the vice president right away, let's not contaminate the transatlantic conversation by a numeric game about 2 percentage points of GDP of NATO investment. We know that we need to do better, but let's focus on other stuff. Germany is a development superpower because this was one of the ways to conduct foreign policy in a post-fascist Germany, so people wouldn't get scared. And if we add together what Germany does in terms of international climate governance, in terms of development, plus the military, our per capita GDP numbers actually look better than yours. So let's talk about an expanded notion of not hard national, but sustainable security. And the third point is, and I think that is thoroughly underestimated in Germany particularly, Germany and Brussels, the Commission in Brussels and the government in Berlin, which is the de facto representation of Europe right now, they have greater leverage in helping to shape the way the United States positions itself globally in multilateral contexts than ever before since 1948, because Gail said that the attitude will be more humble. It is not really realistic to think that somebody in the transition team would advise President Biden to do something that the Europeans and the Germans are completely opposed against, because that would just derail important discussions with important allies during the first months of his administration. So there is European leverage, but to execute that leverage, this requires to, at least for a moment, look at the world from a geopolitical perspective through the eyes of the United States. And that traditionally has been a stumbling block, especially in Germany.
Thank you so much. Of course, we don't know yet for sure who the next president will be. There are, clear indications, but we don't really know yet. Certainly not officially. And
it's exhausting.
Yeah, it's nerve-wracking. Yeah. That's for sure. Before we come to an end, of course, we'd like to have a look at the outcome of our second survey, which we have a look at now. What do you think would change if Joe Biden becomes the new US president? And well, wow, 94% of the people say, of our participants, the US will recommit itself to multilateral agreements and institutions. Around a quarter of our respondents say the US would strengthen its relations to African countries. That is not a very, positive outlook. Could have been more, I think. We have around half of the respondents say 53% the world would invest more in developing programs in the global south than it did under Trump. So not really convinced here either. And nothing will change. Well, this is only 3%. Anyway, so this is what we see here. I don't know, would you like to have a final comment on that? Maybe Gail, since...
Look, I can only tell you where I am if I had voted in that. I would say that if Joe Biden wins the presidency, we will see a re-engaged America, but one which is doing and acting on some serious soul searching. And I would add one hope to that is that obviously people across this country have very strong political views. I think to a point that was made earlier, my hope would be that we can find some space in the middle. Because without that space in the middle, regardless of who wins or loses, governing is going to be more headache than progress. So it's finding those things in the middle. I'm a little opportunistic in saying that one of the things I'm glad in the middle is an issue that's very near to my heart and the focus of my current work, which is development and ending preventable diseases. But I think we've really got to build on that, because this isn't just about a change in the presidency. This is about a fundamental shift, I hope, in the political culture that's been dominant for the last few years. Slowly, slowly, it'll be hard, but I certainly hope we can get there.
Michael, closing remark from your side as well.
Not much to add. Completely agree with Gail. I hope the Europeans are going to be proactive, are going to think about how to engage the North Americans, and I also hope for ethical and moral reasons that the Europeans will not endure another decade with 18 or 19,000 people drowning in the Mediterranean, and will finally address the refugee and migration issues in a much more comprehensive manner, and also understand something that the philosopher Gottfried Hegel already pointed out in his philosophy of history in the 19th century. The border between Europe and the African continent is not the Mediterranean, it's the Sahara. So look at the Mediterranean as a comprehensive space that needs to be managed responsibly, and get engaged. Even if you don't have a nice French Riviera or an Italian coastline, Germany is not a Mediterranean country by far, but it is a part of the self-enlightened interest of all European nations to help Africa to stabilize the current crises, and also to make sure that the whole human toll doesn't keep counting and adding up.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Michael, for your time and for sharing your expertise. It was great talking to you. Thank you so much to all our viewers for their questions and their participation in our service. And of course, thank you to the Global Perspective Initiative, Ingrid Hamm and Teresa Hübscher, for setting this up, and for the team. And yeah, I hope we can all catch up some sleep very soon and see a clear result. But as it seems, it's moving towards more clarity these minutes. Okay,
thank you so much for having us, and thanks everybody.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, Gail.
Goodbye.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye.